The valley had always been quiet. Long before houses lined the hills and paved roads cut through the land, it was just open space, rolling slopes and wind moving through tall grass. People who lived nearby often said the valley felt untouched, like time slowed down there. Birds gathered in the early mornings, and the sunset stretched wide across the sky. It was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted peace. The man who owned the valley liked it that way. He was not loud. He did not attend neighborhood gatherings unless required. He waved politely, kept his distance, and handled his own business. He had bought the land years earlier, long before the area became popular. At the time, few people cared about the valley. It was seen as empty land, useful only for views, as more houses were built nearby. A homeowners association took control of the neighborhood bordering the valley. The HOA had strict rules. Lawns had to be a certain height. Trash cans had to be hidden by a certain hour. Paint colors were approved or denied. At first, most residents went along with it. They believed structure meant safety and higher property value. The HOA president believed something else entirely. She believed control meant power. She had a habit of walking the neighborhood with a clipboard, stopping people mid-conversation, pointing at fences, driveways, or parked cars. She spoke loudly and often repeated herself. Her words always sounded like orders, never suggestions. Over time, neighbors learned to avoid her path. When she noticed the valley, her interest changed from casual to intense. She began asking questions. Who owned it? Why wasn't it maintained the HOA way? Why were there no signs? Why did trucks sometimes pass through the dirt road that led down the slope? Someone mentioned that the quiet landowner held the deed. That answer did not sit well with her in her mind. The valley was part of the neighborhood. It bordered the community. It appeared in photos used in HOA marketing flyers. People enjoyed looking at it from their windows. To her, that meant it belonged to everyone, or at least it should be controlled by the HOA. She sent her first notice on a Monday morning. It was short and official-looking. It stated that the valley area appeared to be unmanaged and possibly in violation of community standards. It requested cooperation and warned of possible action if concerns were not addressed. The landowner read it once, folded it, and placed it in a drawer. He had dealt with paperwork his whole life. He knew the difference between a request and a threat. He also knew when silence was better than reaction. The next notice came 2 weeks later. This one was longer. It mentioned safety risks, erosion concerns, and unauthorized access. It suggested that the HOA might step in to protect the community. Still, he did not respond. That silence bothered her more than an argument would have. At the next HOA meeting, she brought it up publicly. She stood at the front of the room and spoke as if the matter was already settled. There is land being neglected, she said. Land that affects all of us. And the owner has been uncooperative. She did not say his name, but everyone knew who she meant. Some neighbors shifted in their seats. A few exchanged looks. One person quietly mentioned that the land was privately owned. She waved the comment away. That may be true on paper, but responsibility is another matter. The landowner was not at that meeting. He heard about it later from a neighbor who apologized even though they had done nothing wrong. Days passed. Then weeks, she began walking closer to the valley edge. She took photos. She marked areas on printed maps. She talked about future plans, trails, signage, maintenance, all under HOA control. Each time someone questioned her authority, she responded with confidence, not evidence. Leave it to me, she would say. The landowner watched quietly. He noticed the shift. He noticed the way neighbors started looking toward the valley with uncertainty, as if something wrong had been discovered, where peace once lived. He also noticed something else. She had never once asked him directly. One afternoon, as he was checking the fence line near the lower slope, she appeared. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses on. Voice already raised before she was close. You can't be here without approval, she said. He looked at her calmly. I can, he replied. She frowned. This area falls under HOA concern. Doesn't, he said, still calm. She laughed sharply. The kind of laugh meant to embarrass. "We'll see about that," she said. Making a note on her clipboard, she walked away before he could respond. That was the moment he realized. This would not resolve quietly. That evening, he opened the drawer where he had placed the notices. He laid them out on the table, one by one. He pulled out older documents too. Deeds, maps, records, that showed boundaries drawn long before the HOA ever existed. He did not feel angry. He felt patient. Outside, the valley rested as it always had. Wind moved through grass. The sky darkened into night. The land remained unchanged, unaware of the conflict slowly growing at its edge. And while the HOA president believed she was gaining ground, she did not yet understand one simple truth. The valley had always belonged to him. And soon, everyone would know it. Weeks passed, and the tension around the valley began to grow. The HOA president was not one to give up easily. Every morning, she walked the streets, talking to neighbors, pointing out small details she claimed were violations, and whispering about the valley. She painted a picture of negligence and danger, implying that something bad could happen if the landowner did not act the way she thought he should. Neighbors began to feel uneasy. Some avoided speaking to him entirely, unsure whether supporting him meant going against the HOA rules. Others whispered to each other, sharing the president's warnings but not understanding why the landowner never responded. A quiet tension hung in the air, and it affected everyone who lived nearby. The valley, once a peaceful place to look at, now carried a sense of conflict. The landowner continued his routines. He checked the fence lines, tended to small repairs, and walked the trails. He never raised his voice, never made accusations, and never reacted in anger. To him, the valley was a place to care for, not a place to fight over. But he noticed how the president's visits were becoming more frequent, and how she seemed determined to make every interaction a public spectacle. One morning, he was repairing a section of the fence when she appeared again. This time, she had brought a small group of neighbors with her. They looked curious, unsure of what to say, and hesitant to intervene. She pointed directly at the landowner as he worked. "You need to understand," she said loudly, "that this area is important for the safety and appearance of the entire neighborhood. You cannot just do as you please." He put down his tools and wiped his hands on a cloth. "I understand your concern," he said calmly, "but this land belongs to me. I maintain it, I respect it, and I follow the law." The president scoffed. "That may be true legally, but there are community standards you are ignoring. You are creating risks, and you are being uncooperative." Some neighbors shifted uncomfortably. They wanted to support the landowner, but feared being caught in the crossfire. One neighbor finally spoke up. "Isn't he the owner? Doesn't he have the right to do what he wants on his land?" She waved her hand dismissively. Ownership does not mean freedom from responsibility. There are rules, and everyone must follow them.
How?
The landowner remained silent, choosing not to argue. He knew that confrontation in front of the group would only escalate matters. Instead, he continued his work. Quietly showing that he was taking care of the valley, the president's tactics grew sharper. Notices arrived more frequently, each one longer and more formal. She mentioned fines, legal action, and community complaints. Each letter painted him as irresponsible and dangerous, although none of the claims were based on fact. She assumed that repetition would pressure him into submission. She did not consider that he had decades of experience dealing with property, paperwork, and conflict. She did not realize that patience, calmness, and evidence were stronger than yelling and intimidation. The landowner started documenting everything. He filed the letters in order, took photos of the land, and made careful notes of each interaction with the HOA. Each time she visited, he recorded dates, times, and what was said. He kept a calm tone in his notes, never exaggerating. He knew the truth was on his side, and that truth could not be shaken by threats. Meanwhile, the community watched. Some people quietly admired his patience and quiet strength. Others were uncertain, feeling pressure from the president's persistent campaign. The valley became a symbol, a silent witness to the tension between authority and ownership. Between fear and courage, the president decided to hold a meeting at the community center. She announced it as an emergency session to discuss issues related to the valley and its management. She expected confrontation, and she prepared to dominate the conversation. Flyers were sent out, emails were blasted, and the neighbors gathered, curious, anxious, a little excited. The landowner attended, arriving quietly, carrying a folder. He did not announce his presence, and he did not respond to whispers. He simply took a seat, folded his hands, and waited. The president began immediately. She stood at the front of the room, pointing to a large map she had taped to the wall. "This land is crucial to our community," she said. "It is a risk. We need to address who is responsible for it." She spoke with authority, assuming her position as uncontested. Neighbors listened, many nodding out of habit or fear. The landowner remained calm, listening carefully. He noticed the inconsistencies, the exaggerations, and the gaps in her story. When it was time for questions, a few neighbors asked quietly about ownership. The president insisted that she knew better than the legal documents, that her interpretation of community responsibility was what mattered most. The room became tense. Some neighbors nodded in agreement, some frowned. Whispers filled the air. The landowner remained silent, waiting for the right moment. As the meeting continued, the president became more confident, more theatrical. She imagined herself as the hero, defending the neighborhood from chaos. She cited supposed complaints and threats, each one unverified, each one amplified in her voice. She did not notice that some neighbors were beginning to question her methods, noticing how much emphasis was placed on fear rather than fact. After the meeting, the landowner quietly approached a few neighbors. He calmly explained his ownership and showed evidence of maintenance. He did not lecture or scold. He spoke softly and clearly, giving people a chance to understand the truth for themselves. Slowly, doubts began to creep into the minds of those who had believed the president's version. The president, however, was undeterred. She returned to her routine of walking, photographing, and sending notices. Each day, she tried to exert more control. She believed that volume and intimidation could override legality. She did not realize that she was escalating a situation, creating tension that would ultimately expose her authority. By the end of the second month, the valley remained untouched by her influence. The landowner continued his quiet care. The fences were repaired, the trails walked, the land respected. Meanwhile, the president's actions were being recorded, noted, and remembered by the neighbors. Small conversations began to happen quietly, away from her view. Neighbors discussed what they had seen and heard. They shared documents, noted inconsistencies, and began to understand the quiet strength of the landowner. While she sought control through intimidation, he maintained it through patience, calmness, and evidence. The tension had escalated, but the landowner knew that the next step would be decisive. He continued his preparation quietly, gathering documents, planning how to reveal the truth in a way that could not be ignored. The valley remained peaceful, silent witness to the conflict. While the HOA president's attempts to assert control grew ever more obvious and public, it was clear that this was no longer a small neighborhood issue. It had become a test of authority, of truth, and of patience. The landowner understood that the confrontation was approaching, and he remained ready, calm, and unwavering. The valley belonged to him, and he would ensure that everyone, including the president, knew it when the time came. Months had passed since the first letters arrived. The valley remained unchanged, rolling quietly under the sun. Winds sweeping through the grass and shadows stretching along the slopes as usual. But around it, tension had been growing like an invisible storm. The HOA president had become more aggressive, her visits more frequent, and her tone sharper. She believed her authority was unchallenged, and she intended to prove it. She began planning a more direct approach. This time, she would make sure that her message was impossible to ignore. She prepared a meeting and informed all neighbors that attendance was mandatory. Her flyers declared that the valley was a pressing community concern, implying that neglect or misuse could have serious consequences. Everyone knew she meant the landowner. The landowner, aware of the meeting, prepared quietly. He collected documents, maps, and deeds. He checked and double-checked records, making sure every fact was clear. Unlike her, he did not intend to dominate the meeting with theatrics. He planned to present the truth calmly, clearly, without anger. When the day arrived, the community center was crowded. Chairs were filled with neighbors, some curious, some anxious. Cameras had been quietly set up by people who wanted to record the event. The air was thick with anticipation. The HOA president stood at the front, her clipboard in hand, projecting confidence and control. She smiled, or at least thought she was smiling, as she began her speech. "Today," she said loudly, "we are here to address an issue that affects all of us. The valley at the edge of our community has been neglected, and we must discuss how to ensure it meets our standards." Her words were met with nods and quiet murmurs. The landowner sat silently near the back, folder in hand. He did not interrupt. He let her speak, letting the neighbors absorb her words and letting her show her confidence. She pointed to maps, drew lines, and described what she believed were violations, all while projecting authority. Neighbors started asking questions. "Isn't he the owner?" one voice asked. Another added, "Shouldn't ownership allow him to decide how to manage the land?" The president waved them off. "Ownership does not mean freedom from responsibility. We are concerned with community safety and standards. We cannot ignore these risks." The tension grew as she went on, but slowly, whispers among the audience suggested doubt. The landowner knew this moment was coming. When it was his turn, he stood calm and composed and placed his folder on the table. He addressed the room without raising his voice. "I understand the concerns," he began, "but I want to clarify the facts. This valley has been in my family's possession long before the community existed. I maintain it carefully. I follow the law. I respect the environment and safety. The documents I have here show the boundaries, ownership, and maintenance responsibility clearly." He opened the folder and began placing copies of deeds, maps, and maintenance records on the table. He spoke slowly, letting the evidence speak louder than words. The room grew quiet. Neighbors leaned in, examining the papers, reading for themselves. The president's confident tone faltered as she realized she had no proof to counter his claims. Her authority, once assumed, was now being questioned. "Obvious as it may be to you," she said, attempting to regain control, "there are still responsibilities that cannot be ignored. You cannot just do as you please without consideration for the community." The landowner remained calm. "I have always considered the community. That is why I maintain this land and respect safety. My records prove that every aspect of responsibility has been followed. There is nothing in these documents that requires HOA intervention." Some neighbors began speaking up. "It's true," one said. "The documents show he owns it," another added, "and he's maintained it better than anyone else." The president tried to interrupt, but voices rose around her. People who had been silent for months began to see the truth. The balance of power in the room had shifted. She realized that she had underestimated the landowner, that her repeated warnings and threats had not worked, that her authority relied more on fear than fact. Her tone changed from confident to defensive. She tried to regain control by citing supposed complaints, but when pressed for proof, she could not provide it. The room, once obedient, now questioned her. The atmosphere shifted from compliance to scrutiny. Neighbors whispered to each other, examining her claims against the documents laid out by the landowner. The landowner continued calmly. He explained each point, referencing official records and historical documents. He did not mock or attack. He merely presented the facts clearly and logically. He answered questions patiently, showing how each claim the president had made was either inaccurate or exaggerated. The president's frustration grew. She realized that she had become the center of scrutiny. Her previous authority, built on confidence and intimidation, could not withstand the weight of evidence and calm reasoning. She began to lose control of the room. Her notes became frantic, her speeches shorter, her words less certain. Neighbors began speaking openly, questioning her past actions and pointing out inconsistencies. The landowner's patience contrasted sharply with her aggression. It became evident to everyone that the valley had always belonged to him, and that he had acted responsibly at every stage. The balance of power had shifted completely. By the end of the meeting, the president's attempts to dominate the conversation had failed. She had no evidence, no authority to override the landowner's legal rights. The community could see the difference between intimidation and truth. The landowner had remained calm, clear, and composed, letting facts speak louder than emotions. After the meeting, neighbors approached the landowner privately. They thanked him for being honest and patient, for handling the situation without anger, and for letting them see the truth for themselves. The president left the room in frustration, realizing that her public performance had backfired. Her meltdown had not yet come, but the foundations of it were quietly forming as she contemplated how her authority had been undone in front of the entire community. The valley remained the same. Rolling hills, quiet trails, and wind-swept grass had not changed, but around it, the community had shifted. People had begun to recognize calm, strength, preparation, and truth over loudness and intimidation. The stage was set for what would come next. As the president's frustration would soon turn into a public display that would be remembered by everyone present, the landowner remained patient, knowing that his calm approach had brought him closer to the resolution he had been preparing for all along. The following days after the community meeting were filled with whispers, quiet conversations, and a lingering tension. The valley remained unchanged, yet the dynamics around it had shifted entirely. The landowner had shown patience, clarity, and proof that could not be disputed, leaving the HOA president visibly rattled. What no one expected, however, was how quickly her frustration would erupt. It began with small signs: just stopped attending. Informal neighborhood gatherings quietly, no longer walking the streets with her clipboard. Emails and notices, once constant, grew desperate and increasingly formal. It was as if she was searching for a way to regain the authority she had lost in that one meeting. Usual confident steps had slowed. Her words, previously loud and unwavering, now carried an edge of uncertainty. Neighbors started noticing the change. Many quietly felt relief. They no longer feared her presence or her constant scrutiny. Some who had avoided the landowner to stay out of conflict began to approach him with questions, curious about the valley's history and the process he had used to assert his rights. The landowner answered patiently, showing them the documents, explaining the ownership, and emphasizing the importance of patience and preparation when dealing with difficult situations. But the president did not stay quiet for long. She had built her identity around control, and losing it in front of the community was unbearable. One morning, she showed up at the valley with several legal documents and notices. Her expression was tight, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You can't just ignore us," she shouted. "This land affects the entire community, and we have rules that must be followed." The landowner approached slowly, keeping his tone calm. "I have never ignored the community," he said. "I maintain this land responsibly, and I follow the law. Your concerns are noted, but the evidence shows the valley belongs to me, and I have acted appropriately at all times." Papers frantically, hoping the sheer volume would intimidate him. But he simply took one look at the documents, then gestured to the maps and deeds he had previously shown. "These papers don't change ownership," he said gently. "They confirm it. Your notices, repeated threats, and assumptions cannot override the facts." Her face went red, her lips trembled, her hands shook, and for a moment she looked completely lost. The calm authority the landowner displayed contrasted sharply with her visible frustration. Neighbors who had gathered to watch the exchange saw her cracking under pressure, her confidence collapsing. She tried to speak, but her words became jumbled. Threats turned into stammers. Accusations turned into questions she could not answer. You can't," she said, her voice rising and then faltering. It was clear that she was no longer in control, that the power she had wielded for months had slipped through her fingers in front of everyone. The landowner remained composed. He did not mock her. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, a quiet reminder that calm, preparation, and truth were stronger than loudness and intimidation. Some neighbors quietly nodded at him, recognizing the strength and restraint. Others looked on in amazement, seeing for the first time how someone could face aggression without becoming aggressive in return. The president's meltdown continued. She pulled out more papers, hoping one would prove her point, but the landowner's evidence covered every angle. He had records dating back decades, official deeds, survey maps, and maintenance logs. Each document dismantled her claims, leaving her flustered and unable to respond. Her reactions became more emotional. She began pacing, waving her hands and raising her voice unnecessarily. "This isn't fair," she shouted. "I'm trying to protect the community." A few neighbors quietly reminded her that fairness was shown through truth, not intimidation. Their gentle comments seemed to go unheard. Her focus remained on the landowner, the person who had exposed her errors and forced her to confront facts she could not dispute. After a while, she slumped against a fence post, breathing heavily, her papers scattered on the ground. The public display of frustration was unlike anything neighbors had seen from her before. Some whispered to each other, expressing surprise at how completely she had lost control. It was a turning point, a moment of clarity for everyone watching. The landowner, still calm, walked over and helped gather the scattered papers. He handed them back without comment, demonstrating grace and composure. He spoke softly, ensuring that his voice did not add tension. "There is no need for conflict. The land belongs to me, and I maintain it responsibly. Everyone can see the truth in the records. Let's focus on what matters, the valley itself and the safety of the community." Some neighbors stepped closer, offering support or quietly expressing relief. They appreciated the landowner's patience and humility. They had seen the contrast between aggression and calm, between arrogance and preparation. They realized that intimidation could not compete with clear facts and measured responses. For the HOA president, the realization sank in slowly. Her authority had been based on fear and control, and both had crumbled. The evidence presented, combined with the community witnessing her collapse, left her with no way to regain her previous influence. She could argue, shout, and protest. But the truth was irrefutable. Over the next few days, the neighborhood shifted further. People began to speak more openly about ownership and responsibility, no longer afraid of her, the landowner continued, tending the valley quietly, checking fences, walking trails, and keeping records. The valley itself remained unchanged, a silent reminder that nature persisted even amidst human conflict. The president began withdrawing from public engagements. Notices became rare, emails were shorter and less frequent, and her confident walks through the neighborhood slowed. She appeared defeated, aware that she had lost credibility and influence. Her meltdown had become a turning point, a public lesson on the limits of authority without truth. Neighbors slowly returned to their routines, relieved that the tension had eased. Some expressed gratitude to the landowner for handling the situation with dignity and patience. They admired the way he had stayed calm, prepared, and respectful, even when confronted with repeated aggression. His quiet resilience had changed the community's perception, not just of him, but of how power and authority should be exercised. The valley remained the same, serene and undisturbed. Rolling hills, wind through grass, and sunsets stretching across the sky continued as always. But the dynamics around it had transformed. The public meltdown had exposed the flaws in the president's approach, and the community had begun to see the value of patience, preparation, and honesty. The landowner did not celebrate or boast. He maintained the valley with the same quiet care as before. He had shown that strength did not require shouting, that truth was more powerful than fear, and that patience could outlast aggression. The president, though shaken, became a figure of caution, a reminder of how authority can crumble when it lacks grounding in facts. In the weeks that followed, peace returned to the valley. Neighbors walked the trails again without fear of confrontation. Conversations about ownership and responsibility were calm and respectful. The landowner continued his routine, always prepared, always patient, and always mindful of the land he had long maintained. The valley itself, untouched by the human drama around it, stood as a silent testament to the value of calm, patience, and truth in the face of aggression. After the president's meltdown, the neighborhood slowly began to settle into a new normal. The valley, untouched and serene, stood as it always had, but the dynamics around it had changed completely. The landowner continued his quiet routines, checking fences, walking trails, and keeping records of maintenance. He did not boast or speak about the events that had unfolded. Instead, he remained consistent, showing that patience and diligence were stronger than anger or intimidation. Neighbors, previously hesitant or anxious, began to approach him with questions, curiosity, and even respect. They wanted to understand how he had handled the situation, how he remained calm under repeated pressure, and how he had managed to present the truth so clearly. The landowner shared his perspective, always humbly, emphasizing preparation, patience, and calm reasoning. He explained how documentation and evidence were crucial, how listening and observing could prevent mistakes, and how aggression often backfires when met with truth. The HOA president, meanwhile, withdrew from public life. Notices and emails slowed and eventually stopped. Some neighbors reported seeing her avoid community events and gatherings. It was clear that her authority had been permanently weakened, not just in the valley dispute, but in her ability to control the community through intimidation. People began to realize that power built on fear is fragile and short-lived. The valley became a symbol in the neighborhood, a quiet reminder of what patience and calm can achieve. Children played along the trails, couples walked in the evenings, and neighbors occasionally gathered to admire the scenery. The landowner maintained the property with care, never needing to assert dominance or demand recognition. His actions spoke louder than any words could. Occasionally, neighbors would ask about the history of the valley, its boundaries, or the landowner's family involvement. He would answer patiently, recounting stories of past generations, early efforts to preserve the land, and the simple routines he followed to maintain its natural beauty. These stories reinforced a sense of connection and respect within the community. People began to value the land not just for its beauty, but for the care and responsibility it represented. In time, the HOA board reviewed the situation. It became clear that their former president's approach had caused more conflict than benefit. The board discussed changes to prevent similar issues in the future, focusing on clear communication, transparency, and respect for property rights. Some of the former president's policies were revised or removed entirely. The community began to function more harmoniously. With clear boundaries and understanding of legal ownership, neighbors, who had once been afraid to speak, now shared their opinions freely. Meetings became collaborative instead of confrontational. The lessons of the valley dispute resonated. Intimidation and fear can never replace truth and fairness. People realized that patience, preparation, and calm communication are more effective than threats or public displays of power. The landowner, despite the attention, remained humble. He did not seek recognition or praise. He continued to care for the valley as he always had, tending the fences, clearing debris, and walking the trails. His actions were consistent and steady, a quiet reminder that real responsibility does not require an audience or applause. The valley itself became a place for reflection for the community. People who had witnessed the conflict often walked its trails to remember the lessons learned. Children were taught about responsibility and patience. Adults were reminded about fairness and evidence. And neighbors learned to respect boundaries while fostering community spirit. The landowner's example had changed not just perceptions of ownership, but the way people interacted with one another. Months later, a small gathering was held near the valley, not to celebrate conflict or victory, but to simply enjoy the land together. The landowner welcomed neighbors, sharing stories, pointing out features, and listening to theirs. The atmosphere was relaxed and friendly. The previous tension was gone, replaced with understanding, respect, and community connection. The former president remained a topic of conversation occasionally, often as an example of how authority can be misused when based on fear rather than truth. But these discussions were factual and reflective, not fueled by anger. Neighbors understood that she had acted out of her perception of responsibility, but that misjudgment had consequences. The community had learned to balance rules with reality, authority with fairness, and communication with patience. The valley continued to be maintained, protected, and enjoyed. Its quiet hills, rolling grass, and serene trails served as a lasting reminder that calm, preparation, and truth endure longer than aggression and intimidation. The landowner's approach, steady, patient, and evidence-based, had transformed not only the outcome of the conflict, but the entire neighborhood culture in the end. There was no need for revenge or dramatics. The valley remained the same, peaceful and untouched, while the lessons learned shaped the people around it. The landowner's calm strength had turned a potential disaster into an opportunity for education, understanding, and long-lasting respect. The community learned that patience, preparation, and integrity always outlast noise, threats, and public displays of power. And the valley, as it always had, stood quietly as a testament to truth, responsibility, and quiet resilience. Life in the valley continued to move quietly the way it had always done. The landowner maintained his routines, tending defenses, walking the trails, and keeping the land in excellent condition. The community had grown used to the peace, and neighbors began to interact with each other more openly, without fear of confrontation. The tension from the previous conflicts had slowly faded, leaving a sense of calm and stability that many had not experienced before. People often visited the valley now, enjoying its wide-open spaces and the views it offered. Children played near the trails, couples strolled along the paths, and neighbors would sometimes gather to share a quiet moment watching the sun set over the rolling hills. The landowner welcomed these visits, always humble and respectful, never seeking attention or praise. He simply enjoyed seeing the land appreciated and respected by those around him. The HOA president had largely retreated from public life. While she still held a position on the board, her influence was diminished. Neighbors no longer feared her, and her previous tactics of intimidation were ineffective. She occasionally tried to intervene, but her attempts were now met with polite but firm responses from both the landowner and the board members. Her authority had been permanently weakened, and she slowly adapted to a less controlling role within the community. Over time, the community began to focus on more positive initiatives. Neighbors worked together to improve common areas, host small events, and foster a sense of connection. They shared knowledge about local plants, wildlife, and conservation efforts, often learning from the landowner's careful management of the valley. His example of patience, responsibility, calmness inspired others to approach challenges in the same way. One morning, a small group of neighbors approached the landowner with an idea. They wanted to create a nature trail in the valley, allowing more people to enjoy the space without disturbing its natural beauty. The landowner listened carefully, considering their proposal. He agreed, but only under the condition that the trail would be maintained properly and that visitors would respect the land. Together, they planned the trail, marking paths, adding signs, and ensuring safety measures were in place. The project brought the community closer together. Neighbors volunteered to help, learning about sustainable trail design and how to care for the environment. Children were taught about the importance of respecting nature, understanding boundaries, and appreciating quiet spaces. The landowner led by example, showing that leadership could be gentle, consistent, and rooted in knowledge rather than force. Meanwhile, the former HOA president observed the project quietly. She could no longer dominate discussions or impose her views through threats. Watching the community work together, she began to understand that collaboration and respect could achieve more than confrontation ever could. Although she had struggled to accept it at first, she gradually adapted, participating in the project in a limited role and learning to communicate more effectively with neighbors. As the trail neared completion, the valley became a place of education and enjoyment. Schools organized small field trips, families spent weekends exploring the paths, and local wildlife thrived without interference. The landowner remained the quiet guardian of the space, ensuring that everything remained in balance. He never sought recognition, but people came to respect him deeply. Recognizing his role in preserving both the land and the sense of community, the valley had become more than just a piece of land. It was now a symbol of patience, responsibility, and calm leadership. The lessons learned from the conflict with the HOA president remained relevant. Neighbors shared stories about how evidence, preparation, and respectful communication had resolved a potentially destructive situation. Children grew up hearing these stories, understanding that truth and patience often outweigh aggression and intimidation. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the landowner walked the trails alone. He paused to look at the valley, the wind moving through the grass, the birds returning to their nests, and the shadows stretching long across the landscape. He reflected on the past months, the challenges he had faced, and the way the community had grown and learned. There was satisfaction, not in victory or recognition, but in the quiet knowledge that things had been handled with integrity. Neighbors continued to visit, sharing stories, offering small gestures of gratitude, and enjoying the serene environment. The valley had become a central part of the community's identity, a reminder that patience, preparation, and calmness could overcome conflict. Even the HOA president had learned from the experience, slowly adjusting her behavior and contributing in ways that respected the landowner's authority and the community's trust. As the seasons changed, the valley remained constant. Spring brought wildflowers and gentle rains. Summer offered long days of sun and warmth. Autumn painted the hills in rich colors, and winter brought quiet blankets of frost. Through it all, the landowner continued his work quietly, ensuring that the valley remained a sanctuary for both nature and the people who appreciated it in time. The valley became a story told among neighbors, a real-life lesson in patience, calmness, and responsibility. People spoke of how a single individual, acting with integrity and respect, had navigated conflict without resorting to anger or aggression. They remembered the former HOA president's meltdown, not as a spectacle to mock, but as a turning point that demonstrated the limits of intimidation and the enduring power of truth. The landowner's example influenced the community in many ways. Children learned to handle disagreements with calm reasoning. Adults learned the value of preparation and evidence. The community itself became more cohesive, focusing on collaboration rather than control. The valley stood as a living reminder that quiet perseverance and respect for truth could transform